Hello everyone, to those of you who have just turned up. This is a fairly conversational webinar. I hope we can get a little bit of interaction. You've seen there's a question I want you to think about, and some of you have given responses already. We'll come back to that a little later on. I'm not sure we'll get through everything, but I'm relaxed about that. The aim is to find some interesting common ground, perhaps even some disagreement around the importance and the type of leadership required, as Lizzie described, in the kind of uncertain times that we live in. Apologies if I'm coming through a little unclear. I've got a truck outside my office window doing some work right now, so that noise is probably coming through a little bit. As Lizzie has said, I'm at Dublin City University. I haven't always been at Dublin City University, but it's a great place to work. And Dublin more particularly, I guess more generally even Ireland is a great place to work. For those of you outside of Ireland, I know we've got Gavin here based in Ireland, really the hothouse of activity for companies such as Google and Microsoft and just go back to the previous slide, head office for LinkedIn, head office for Twitter, and so forth. So it's a very dynamic place to work in the IT sector. Prior to moving to Ireland, I was based in New Zealand, and I'm sure those of you, most of you, I see your names, know me in one capacity or another. But prior to coming to Ireland, not quite 4 years ago, but almost, I was the national director for the director of the National Centre for Teaching and Learning based at Massey University in New Zealand. I also had another job which was called Director of the Distance Education and Learning Futures Alliance, rather grand title. And what that meant was that I was responsible for the online distance learning portfolio at Massey University, where there were around 17,000 distance students to go with another 17,000 campus-based students. So I've had a reasonable amount of experience in fairly senior roles within universities. But I want to kind of come back a little bit to start off by telling more of my own story. And a lot of this whole webinar is really story-based in many respects, because we each have our leadership stories, and some may cross over and resonate, and other elements will go in different directions. In my own case, here I am, I'm the one in the middle, and in fact, this one probably is very relevant for me just in the last 24 hours, because it's a picture of me growing up in New Zealand, where I'm originally from. I actually got off plane about 1 o'clock yesterday, having just flown back from New Zealand. So I'm probably doing okay at this time of day to be doing this session, hopefully not too incoherent, or quite the opposite in a positive way. Hopefully I can make this relatively coherent, stuffing a little bit in jet lag, but not too much. So here I was, and I have two brothers. I caught up with them for the period, and I grew up in a very small rural country area. What you're looking at in that slide is the whole school. You can see how old I am, because that's when I was, I won't say my age specifically, but that's when I first started school. And you can see me ring-fenced there. And I suppose I'm kind of building a little narrative around change and uncertain times. If I move on a little bit, you can see that I was particularly fashion conscious even back then. Here I am wearing the height of fashion and still wearing a tie today, unfortunately, in some respects. How times change. I don't know if many of you have children that wear ties today, but certainly in those times that was quite common. Because I grew up in a country area, we had no television and no radio. And that, even today, I have to think back quite carefully to those times and think, was that really the case? And it certainly was until I was about 12 years of age. So without the ability to have radio, primarily because we were in a very remote part, lots of hills, so reception wasn't possible, and television most definitely wasn't, we had to be fairly self-sufficient. And I remember with a vivid memory that just after 1970, when Expo 70 took place in Japan, Expo 2020 will be a big thing in Dubai, if you're not familiar, having just flown through Dubai. In those times, these expos were very, very important. And as a consequence of the Expo 70, where the Encyclopedia Britannica put out a special issue, they were then being sold at a reduced cost. Now, we have to take our minds back quite a long way, and some of you may not be old enough to remember this. Hopefully many of you can. People used to come knocking on our doors, selling encyclopedias, knocking on our homes. And their sort of argument was, oh, what price can you place on your son or your daughter's education? What an investment in the future in buying this encyclopedia. And in European terms, I suspect they were probably up to 1,000, if not more, euro, not that the euro existed then. So these were not cheap resources, but they were being presented and sold in small payments, monthly payments. I was lucky, you could say, because my parents, who were teachers, managed to get a very cheap copy, copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica that was being off-sold from the leftovers from Expo 70. Why I'm telling you this story is because I might be a little unusual. I think I am a little unusual, hopefully not too unusual, because I started to read the Encyclopedia Britannica as a child of about 10 years of age. It was all I really had. So I'm well sought after for trivia quiz nights, as an aside. I didn't read all of it, but I set out with that mission to do so. Some of the encyclopedia is a bit tedious, but it's really just to take your mind back again to times that were very different. Those of you who are not familiar with the research on Wikipedia, because the Encyclopedia Britannica is quite an important metaphor to use to anchor this discussion in, because I think it was only last year where it was stopped, or might have been the year before, to be produced in a hard copy form. And if we're interested in the kind of factual encyclopedia-like knowledge that once was available through publications such as the Britannica, we now typically turn to Wikipedia, or in a Google search on something, Wikipedia usually turns up fairly high up in the order, if not at the top. This research is a little out of date now, so I need to acknowledge that, more than 10 years out of date, but educators both in the schooling system but at higher education level often frown upon the use of Wikipedia sources. But this study showed that the information available in Wikipedia was just as accurate, if not slightly more accurate, than what was available in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So that's something that I often use just to remind people just how far we've come in the online world, and the way in which it has replaced or displaced some traditional sources of information. I won't say knowledge necessarily. Having said that, just to wrap up this introduction, I often use this as an example of how far we've come, how times have changed. I won't necessarily suggest this is all progress. For whom were these sorts of questions addressed? BG being before Google. So you do wonder in the future to what extent time will be measured by the kind of impact that the internet, I think, which is the really revolutionary aspect, not Google per se, but actually the internet is the real transforming agent here, or technology. Who were these questions asked before Google? Ultimately, the reason for telling you this little bit of a story to my background is to make the point that the future is not what it used to be. And as we work in higher education, and I suspect I'm not telling any of you anything that you don't appreciate and live in your day-to-day jobs, but it is, I think, helpful for us to understand just how dynamic and fluid the times are, and uncertain the times are, which creates particular challenges for educational leaders. There are some who would say that these changes are not as radical as we might think. I won't debate that at this point in time, but it certainly does create a challenge for an educational leader. So on that note, what I would like to do in the next 40 minutes or so is talk or break this discussion into 3 parts. I say discussion, hopefully we can get some discussion going. because I've got a little bit of time at the end of each of these three parts to interact. By all means, please do ask questions in the Q&A or have some back channel discussion in the chat box. And if you want to use the microphone, as Lizzie said at the outset, you can just put your hand up and we can pass over the microphone. So why leadership? What type of leadership? And then I'll just touch on, if time's available, some cases in action of leadership. But in many respects, you're probably living those cases. And I think this session is much more interesting to reflect on leadership more generally in the context of the challenges we face. Another thing on a very personal note I want to share is that for those of you who just come in recently into the room, my own background has had me in a number of leadership roles, but when I was sitting there in that cart, that go-kart right at the outset, I might bring that up, just flick back quickly for those who have just arrived. When I was sitting there in the middle with my two brothers, did I have any conception of where I would be now and the sort of leadership work that I would be doing? Absolutely not. And I suppose even taking that another step, when I was first asked to take on a leadership role, I had to ask myself, firstly, why me? And then secondly, can I do it? And I use this as a personal example because I found in the past that many other people who are asked to take on leadership roles similarly have this sense of the imposter syndrome. Somehow not feeling they're good enough, somehow feeling they'll be found out. And I openly, self-reflexively talk about this because I think it's very helpful, because when you discover that many other people in leadership roles and formal positional leadership roles have the same feelings, it's actually quite reassuring. And I actually see it as a very good trait to have, because you're constantly questioning oneself and asking yourself whether in fact what you're doing is the right thing. So I'm anchoring it in that. And when I was first asked to take on a leadership role in the centre of the university, director of something that morphed into then some other positions, I sought out actively literature on leadership in higher education. This particular book has a lot of meaning for me. It happened to be one of the publications I came across. I would highly recommend it. I think it's in its 3rd edition now. Highly recommended. In fact, I went on to get to know the original author quite well, and over time, this would be at least a decade ago, we went on to produce an online program in leadership training and professional development for people working in higher education with EPGM, which is now a company owned by Oxford University Press. So I actually kind of walked the talk, because I found there was a dearth of leadership material relevant to people in higher education, a lot from business, a lot in the schooling sector, but at that time, more than a decade ago, the literature was not as mature as it is now. Lastly, before we get started on the first section, I've then also gone on to research the field of leadership myself, and this publication, I'm sorry, I haven't put the URL there, but a Google search won't be too difficult, looked at, as perhaps the subtitle suggests at the bottom, the big and small actions of many people, and gives you a sense of my own philosophy of leadership, which perhaps in many respects comes and is operationalized a lot more through the metaphor of what animal you might be. I'm going to come back to this again, but I've deliberately put this slide in now because I had it right at the outset, but I know we've had a few more people come into the room. I do want you in the chat box, as you look at these, and please, any animal whatsoever, I'll reveal the animal that best describes me as a leader in another 5 minutes or so, but by all means, if you feel comfortable, please do indicate which animal perhaps best fits you. I'm not necessarily saying leadership styles here, because there is a little bit of question as to the validity of the styles literature, but as a leader, the characteristics of a leader. Okay, so that's a lot of preamble before we get started on why leadership. Let me just catch my breath, see the chat window, see if there's anything anyone wants to ask at this point. I'll just pause and see if you've got any thoughts or questions or anything that I've said today that you might want me to follow up on before we launch any further. I'll have a quick drink as well. Thanks, Hilary. Okay, so let me continue. I'm always conscious in these webinars, I'm not a huge fan of the word webinar, that this ends up being me talking down a pipe. Hopefully we can avoid that, but I'll continue. Why leadership? Firstly, I think one of the uncomfortable realities of the rhetoric around, or the discourse around new models of teaching and learning, I deliberately use that language from the modernisation reports on the European Commission, is that the truth is somewhat less optimistic or less rosy, that the old pump, pump, dump model of teaching and learning still dominates our practice. In other words, very behaviourist, very instructionalist forms of teaching, as the image there famously captures, is still the dominant approach, the way that we take new technologies and apply them using very old traditional ways of teaching. And without some form of transformative turnaround leadership, then I don't think much will change. These things are always never binaries, and that's they're not quite as simple as I might make out here. But I'm sure you've seen images like this to suggest that somehow we're applying 19th century technology to 20th century, sorry, 19th century as technology to 20th century technology. Well, of course, we're now talking 21st century, and we're not getting anything different than we had previously. I don't think it's quite as bleak as that. And the other way of looking at extending this transportation metaphor is that from Henry Ford, if we'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses at the time. So in many respects, one of the challenges we face with new technology in education is we don't know what we don't know. Some of the solutions that we're now discussing and looking at, this way that they can be applied in education, unless we do attempt, and MOOCs fall into this, unless we do embrace them and try to see how they can be used, we may not understand how they ultimately could have greatest impact. I'm sure we're all very familiar with the avalanche metaphor, which comes from a famous, infamous now, I guess we would say, report funded primarily by Pearson's, that there's this avalanche that higher education is facing. And why leadership? Well, I'm not sure, given that that report is now some years old, that higher education is quite facing the avalanche as the metaphor, but most definitely, if to prevent the avalanche or to steer our path through rocky terrain, we need leaders. If the avalanche metaphor is relevant, then it's relevant particularly to a business context. If you think back to good old Kodak, in 1976, they had 89% of the market share. The doom merchants amongst some of the education community, or perhaps it's outside of the education community, would suggest that universities and institutes of technology, even community colleges in the US context, have their days numbered. Again, I think we've perhaps already seen that that isn't quite the case. But nonetheless, we can't underestimate the Uber effect, albeit that Uber is now not as profitable, or not even profitable at all, I believe. And let me just bring up the next slide. Yes, the Uber sort of effect in the transformation that Uber has had on traditional taxis as a business model. Now, people such as Clayton Christensen, you may be familiar with some of his publications here, use these examples to reinforce the disruptive nature of innovation and new technologies on higher education. If you haven't already detected, my own perspective is reasonably critical, hopefully not conservative, but reasonably critical of the message that's coming through this kind of popular literature. After all, education is not a business, education is not a product. Education at best is a co-construction. It's something that's an exchange. Some might say it's a service. I don't even think I'd agree that it's a service. So business models like Kodak and Uber don't strictly apply. Having said that, we do need to take heed of some of the messages as leaders and why we need leaders. The OECD is quite a useful resource in this respect, because over the years, they've published a number of scenarios about the future of higher education. If you're not familiar with them, this is just to give you a taste of the scenarios. In the most recent report, they've identified 4 scenarios for the future of higher education. Perhaps most disturbingly from my perspective, hopefully for many of you as well, the 4th scenario of higher education incorporated is one in which public institutions no longer exist, or at least they're owned in partnership with private providers. That's not to be an anti-for-profit institutions. Of course, in the US, they're quite an important provision, but to really, in my view, argue that we need leaders to speak strongly about the importance of public education, the public good of higher education. I suppose that turns me then to why leaders reflecting on some of the major change forces that we're currently facing. So let me just pause for a minute, give you the opportunity here. If you're thinking in your respective roles as leaders, what are some of the big issues that leaders are addressing right now as we look to the future? Feel free to drop those into the chat box if you like. Let me just give you one. I think globalization is one of the major change forces. But what are some of the other change forces? I'll just stop for a second and have a sip of water. Yeah, sustainability, absolutely, in all of its forms. Don't be shy in coming forward. No right or wrong answers here. Yeah, that's a really good one, Eamon. The extremism that we're seeing, that I guess identifies or depends on one's perspective, but absolutely, and I think that's linked to big issues around mobility, migration, poverty, and so forth. Yes, ethics, privacy, particularly in a European context. Excellent. Well, I've got some prepared here, so let me see how we match up, but by all means, keep adding to the list. So I mentioned globalization, so population mobility, demographic changes. The demographic change in the Western world, in most developed countries, links to the aging population and the impact that that's going to have, particularly on the ability for people to remain affluent in retirement, be able to have an affordable period in which they can retire. In some countries, the retirement age is increasing quite quickly. Of course, such as also is the age in which we are now living. These are major change forces. Changing nature of work, that's both linked to new technologies, but also in the type of societies we live in. The changing nature of work, of course, at the moment is linked frequently to the impact that artificial intelligence might have. Growing demand for higher education, if you're not familiar with some of the literature, and the OECD generally published the most notable predictions, there is an exponential growth in demand for higher education predicted, to the point that it would not be possible for us to build enough institutions, whether they be universities or some other form of higher education institution, to meet that demand. Physically, we couldn't meet the demand, which brings online blended into the equation. Let's switch that question a little bit to what are some of the major change forces shaping the future of higher education. So the distinction here, as I was talking previously more at a societal level, now I'm talking about higher education. I just jumped straight to the gun here rather than give you the chance to come in, but I'm sure that if I hadn't left this question without anything on the slide, you would have come up with some of these sorts of examples. Generally, the openness movement, I think, is probably one of the biggest things that's now really having an impact on higher education, and not just teaching. Research, the open access movement is huge. I do think, I just want to pick up on the point around extremism going back. I think that's going to also have an impact on higher education in the sense of, I know in my own institution, how we're looking at trying to provide adequate and appropriate education for refugees. But at a bigger picture level here, unbundling, similar to the Uber example, which is often cited in the unbundling world, that there is now pressure to unbundle the credential that an institution offers from all the services that could be offered by other providers. I've mentioned artificial intelligence, learning analytics, which is one of the big elements linked to, I suppose, the whole big data movement more generally. The question about whether, in fact, degrees or official formal qualifications are required anymore. The rise of the badging movement, arguably driven by what employers now expect, as well as what learners are wanting, so on and so forth. So all of this, remember, is under the heading, why leaders? Why leadership? Well, we're facing all of these pressures, and leadership for me is just absolutely crucial in navigating some form of path towards a better future. But we can't work on predictions of the future because we know the future can't be predicted. But I think what we can do is at least anchor our thinking about leadership in what we might consider to be some of the high impact uncertainties or critical uncertainties. So I just put these up here. They're entirely debatable, but these are some predictions. Perhaps predictions isn't the right word. These are some assumptions that I'm grounding a lot of my thinking as a leader in, that the growth of online provision is only going to continue in the future, that we will see increasing emergence of micro-credentials, for better and worse, that we're going to see, because of the way societies are changing, greater demand for part-time study options. We know in the UK it's kind of not the case, but that's structural because of government policy. To some degree that's the same in Ireland, but there are all sorts of indicators to show that the demand in the future is more around earning while one is learning. There is potential to reduce the cost of qualifications in higher education as we increase supply. That's quite debatable. Depends on the value that's placed on the institution's reputation in some respects. Again, debatable, but I think the US is a good example, looking at Jill, who's from the US here, from the Online Learning Consortium, that in the future we're likely to see governments continue to reduce the funding for higher education. And that's going to create a challenge for institutions. Increased demand for customized study options, personalized options. Again, these are debatable things, but one has to work out where you sit and how important these critical uncertainties are in the leadership context. I certainly think that our staff are demanding more flexibility, our teachers, just as our learners are in the future. I fully expect to see far more strategic alliances between institutions. At DCU, we have a number of alliances, the most notable with Arizona State University. And then we're going to see a lot more around new technological innovation. So there's kind of some of the uncertainties as a leader that I think we face, and I've tried to indicate for you some of my own assumptions about those uncertainties. What I try to do then in a leadership role is to put these into a scenario planning context or matrix. I used the OECD example previously. There are different models and frameworks you can use, but let me just use one here with the axis, the x-axis, showing disruptive business models and conventional business models. And if I place on the y-axis here, we've got those axes around the right way. That's a bit of jet lag coming through. Standardized courses, pretty much what we have now, versus customized course delivery options, much more tailored or personalized. So you could plot here 4 different scenarios for the future of higher education just on these 2 critical uncertainties, the business model and the kind of package that's delivered, the course package. So this is all around why leadership and the need to be proactive and not reactive as a leader. And so this is the kind of discussion we're having at DCU, but also at a European level, as to where do we see our institutions within these different scenarios. I won't take time to elaborate on each of them, but the scenario that's coloured there, scenario 1, is basically what we have now. We have very standardised courses with a relatively conventional business model. What would scenario 4 look like in the future, and what might we need to do as a leader to reach that kind of scenario, if that was deemed to be the desirable scenario? I won't populate that more. I've really just tried to make the case here. It's a little bit fragmented, this discussion, around the importance of being proactive, that leadership requires some form of transformation in the age that we live, but it needs to be in the pursuit of some kind of big ideas, what we're really looking for, whether that be scenario 4 or whether we want to maintain the status quo of the scenario 1, to use the examples on the previous slide. Ultimately, I think if I sum up the question, why leadership? Well, the future is not something we enter, the future is something we create. I know this is a bit of a cliche, it's very easy to use words like this, but it is most definitely the case that we do have some agency, the ability to shape our own future. And that's the most important reason, I think, why we need leadership right now. So I'll stop on that note, move on to the next session shortly, but let's just see if there's any feedback, questions, comments, points for clarification, and so forth. I could probably talk at some length, as I do in other occasions, around how you can use scenario planning to be much more proactive as a leader. Okay, we're not getting a lot of interaction, so I'm going to push on at this stage in the classic example of being a bit content driven, but nonetheless, let me continue and hopefully we can get a little bit more engagement in this next section around what type of leadership then is required in this sort of uncertain future. This is where I am going to return to the animal example and reveal, as I said previously, a little bit of my own leadership background and approach. So I want to give you 4 examples. They are grounded in the literature loosely of different types of leaders who tend to be in 4 different points of a compass, if you like. I say they're loosely grounded in the literature because they're anchored around 4 different metaphors. Well, the metaphors happen to be animals, hence that original question. I've turned these animals into some animals that are native to New Zealand. They often are used in another context, the North America context. But let me see how they work for you. And as I'm talking about leadership, I want you to reflect on your own approach to leadership. And that question I asked around what leader, which animal best describes you, if you like, as a leader. The first at the top of the compass is the Haast eagle. This happens to have been the biggest eagle, the biggest bird, in actual fact, known to humankind. The wingspan was ginormous. Native to New Zealand, now extinct. The eagle, in this context, as a leader, is able to soar above everything, has the ability to see the big picture, look for new opportunities, see over the horizon, has a sense of vision, if you like. So that's the kind of characteristic of this particular leadership trait. Let me contrast that now with the second animal or metaphor, which happens to be the kura, the native New Zealand dog. Now, everyone loves a dog, don't they? The dog comes up, people pat it, it has the soft skills. Dogs are very relational. So this is the kind of leader that's able to make connections, build relationships with people, very people-centric, interested in the person as much as interested in the outcome. So here, the example of the dog, I think, even though this particular dog similarly is now extinct, perhaps in its imagery doesn't conjure up being particularly worthy of patting and looks a little ferocious. I guess the point here is this is the kind of leader that is able to build and make connections. The third example happens to also be a bird. Doesn't look like a bird, but it is, and it's known as the moa. Similarly extinct, but this was similar to an ostrich in some respects. But as you can see, if you can see that image, the people in the background, it was ginormous, huge. Died out about 200 years ago, 250 years ago in New Zealand. This is the kind of leader that isn't afraid of doing the heavy lifting, can make things happen, very good at working to deadlines, very good at getting things done and picking up the slack. You can rely upon this person, if you like. As I'm talking here, these sound rather cliche-like and a little too falling into 4 different boxes when you see the next one. Obviously, leadership's not like this, but it's an attempt just to get you to think about yourself as a leader. And I'll make a comment about the importance in a minute of all of these. The fourth being here, the native New Zealand bat. A very, very unusual bat, this. And bats see the fine detail. They find the cracks. In many respects, the light comes through the cracks. They have the ability to ask questions that others don't even see, that need to consider the question in the first place, really into the detail. Now, each of these animals I've described, I've asked you if there's one of those that fits for you. If it was for me, I guess I'd have to describe myself as falling more into the Hask Eagle category. But the truth is, leadership today requires all of these dimensions. It is not possible to be an institutional leader in whatever your role by simply just being an eagle. You need to have the other dimensions. But what that conjures up is that it's impossible for one person to have all of these traits of leadership, all of the skills. It's important to try to develop as many as possible, particularly the emotional leadership side now that perhaps the dog offers. But it suggests that actually we need to understand how leadership is inherently distributed across contexts. It's no longer something that resides in the hands of someone at the top of an institution. I did say at the outset to take these as metaphors quite loosely, and what I've just described does have an anchoring in the literature, but all generalizations are dangerous around the sort of literature, and hence the slide that you're looking at now. More seriously, I want to take that as an example to just now build on to say, what does the literature tell us about leadership in higher education? What do we know about leadership? Building on what I've just described through those examples, again, a little popularist, but nonetheless, I think there's a really good seed of truth in these, that the job of the leader is to grow more leaders, not to be the center of all attention. And that's something even in the people that I work with. I know I've got some colleagues, close colleagues in this group today. Some people still see themselves as the leader at the pinnacle, at the front. If you think of the birds here, the Canadian geese, why they fly in formation like this, so the leadership can be rotated. It's impossible for one bird to lead from the front for the distances that they travel. Taking that one step further, anchoring it in some literature and a particular book that I would thoroughly recommend to you by Jeff Scott and Michael Fulham. The idea of the Lone Ranger leader is completely obsolete now. And so we really need to be thinking about distributed models of leadership and the importance of building micro leaders. And this is relatively new, to be honest, in our thinking in leadership literature and how we nurture and value micro leadership. Perhaps the leaders of the future in more positional roles, but that leadership is not just linked into positional responsibilities. And so just another quote that comes from the work of Jeff Scott in particular, who studied leadership in universities and studied very senior leaders. And he found there were 3 things they all had in common. and in this order. They listened, they linked, and then they led. So all three of those things, but the listening was most important at the outset. You might wonder, what am I talking about all of this? It's nothing linked into the role of new technologies and the uncertain future. Well, I'm talking about leadership because if we're not anchoring our work in something that we know about in terms of leadership and drawing on literature, then I think we are on shaky ground and in danger of being technology driven, or at least not having a compass that's anchored in something where we have a sense of purpose, a moral purpose in some respects. One of the big gaps in our thinking around leadership, though we often talk about top-down or bottom-up forms of leadership, but increasingly this body of literature emphasizes the importance of the middle out, how the middle is really the key glue of leadership. And that means that many of you are probably in middle leadership responsibilities or roles, just how important those roles are to nurture and support. Ultimately, though, whatever leadership position you're in, if you don't plan, then you plan to fail. Again, a little bit of a cliche, but setting SMART goals is really crucial in this period that we are working in. Even in such fluid times, you can set plans. Having said that, if any of you have a business background, you may be familiar with Kotter's change model. For me, this is a very linear model, and I think we need to move out of linear ways of thinking about leadership and planning for the future, and recognize that the kind of world we work in is much more like a complex ecology, a complex range of variables where when you insert something new into the environment, into the ecology, there are unpredictable outcomes. We don't know what might change. And so working with an ecological metaphor, we need to be much more sensitive to the changes and to the sustainability of our ecology. And this metaphor is actually also quite useful because people who also often cite the Gartner hype cycle or change sort of cycle typically suggest that many technologies fail to have the impact that they were predicted to. Actually, that impact in an ecological metaphor or model is much more subtle and much more complex, and actually the change has taken place, it's just that we don't see it because it's ongoing. Ultimately, in wrapping up this discussion, again, I'm not sure how well the threads are being held together. We'll see you, Corey, but the one lesson I want to leave you on around leadership before we have a little bit of time to talk about some examples is, and I think this fits neatly with an ecological metaphor as well, because I'm talking about an ecology, a whole culture, and made up of many subcultures or microhabitats, is ultimately you can have all the lovely strategies and plans, but it's the culture that makes the difference. Culture eats strategy for lunch. And why leadership is so important, not just on one person, but on all the micro leaders, is that culture is built by those people, by us. So I'll stop on that note as I head into the final session, which we have about maybe 10 minutes to go. Seems very monologue for me, but that's often typically what happens with a webinar. I haven't built in fancy quizzes along the way. At this point, again, I'm just going to give you a chance to ask any questions. I see Keith is just talking about middle out. I certainly would recommend the particular article that I shared there, and these slides will be available as the recording. Should be easy to find. It's an open access article. I think often there's an important distinction to be made here between leadership and management. If you're familiar with the business literature, sometimes leadership, or the distinction that's made is, and I certainly err myself more as a leader than a manager, a leader asks, is this the right thing to do? And if it is the right thing to do, I go ahead and do it, hopefully in consultation with others. The manager will ask, if this is the right thing, how should I do it? Have I done it appropriately according to the rules of the institution? I'm less concerned about how I do it whether it complies with the rules of the institution, as long as that's the right thing to do. But the truth is, management and leadership are actually hand in hand, glove in hand. The two need to go together. Okay, well, let me bring up some very brief examples of my leadership in action. When I say I, that sounds very egotistical. It's not intended to be so, but at the same time, as an eagle, having some vision and trying to lead by seeing a different future, that's important that others come along with you. You can't do that by yourself. So it is a team effort, but it is the nature of eagles. And it's one of the failings of eagles, because it might not be the direction we should be going. But nonetheless, I want to give you some examples from my own experience. It's important, just coming back to that point, why you have other animals and a diversity of leaders around you in your culture. So at DCU, we have a long history of provision of distance education. Over 30 years, where once the National Centre for Distance Education in Ireland was hosted by DCU. One example I want to share with you is when I arrived, our offerings for online delivery were known through a brand, a term. I don't like using the word brand in education, but known as OSCIL, which is an Irish word for open learning. It didn't really have much brand recognition even within Ireland, but if you go back to those assumptions that I referred to previously about the future, we understand that the demand for higher education is going to grow exponentially. We understand that we can't build enough institutions for for physical opportunities for face-to-face education. And online has to be a provision. And also, if you work on the assumption that higher education is now inherently global. So one of the very first things that I led, with extensive consultation across our institution, was the shift in thinking away from our provision of distance online education through OSCIL to a whole new platform. I'll use that language rather than brand, in introducing DCU Connected. Actually, we have a different strapline now, which happens to be, I think, excellence in online education. There's a side story, if I get time to tell you about. The importance about DCU Connected is language really matters in leadership and in your institutional culture. So what we wanted to do here was get away from using the word online, because we didn't really see 10 years from now that online would be a word that we would be worrying much about, just like e-learning has in many respects fallen off in its currency. But more importantly than just shifting the language from online learning, we wanted to shift the language away from a delivery method or mode, in this sense down a pipe, to the experience of the learner. So rather than be institutionally centric, to be more learning centric. So here, being connected is about being connected to your educational institution, your provider, wherever you are. So that's really quite symbolic. And in some respects, still a little bit, I think, ahead of the time in many other institutions. You see, we could have just said DCU online, and that would have been fine. People would have known what it was. But it didn't take us to where I think we want to be going, which is much further away from where just the online provision may have taken us. So I'm trying to give you a sense of how, as a leader, language really matters and the metaphors you use. I was very lucky in a new position to have a small period where you can get things done. I happen to have also the luxury of reporting through to the president. So that makes it quite powerful. I'm just showing you a slide from when we managed to launch a whole new website to support DCU Connected, which in itself, to create a whole new website independent of the university's website, is quite a coup. Ironically, only a matter of weeks ago, we managed to launch a new website that now is back within the institution, which is also very symbolic and very important to us because it makes it more mainstream. But at the time, we couldn't launch DCU Connected without creating a whole new website. So as a leader, bringing people along, getting them to own the concept, getting them to understand the narrative, the story that went with it, was very, very important. and the story was different from what other stories are being told. And in some respects, I know Jill has a connection here to Penn State. This was published, I think, about just over a year ago now, that the term online arguably is dying because it's so now the new normal that it doesn't give you any particularly strategic advantage. This comes from the context of Penn State, who have their very well-known World Campus, one of the major online providers in the US. The second example I want to give in my role as a leader, again, I'm emphasizing this is not just me, it would be doomed to fail if it was, is in my own institution, Moodle was the virtual learning environment, or VLE, the LMS, the learning management system. It took me a minute there with the jet lag to change my language from North American to European to Southern Hemisphere. Well, Moodle doesn't exactly conjure up anything about what the nature of the learning experience would be, nor do I say with Blackboard or Canvas as a top name or any of the other LMSs. So this gave a great opportunity to have a conversation around what's the nature of the experience that we want our virtual learning environment to be and to support for learners. Cutting a long story short, as a platform that works in concert with DCU Connected, and working with a marketing agency and our own internal people, we came up with our virtual learning environment being known as Loop. A loop of people, a loop of technologies, that people are able to include their own technologies in the loop. That our virtual learning environment, Moodle, is at the core, but that doesn't prevent Snapchat being part of the loop. Whereas many institutions would see that, oh no, you can't use Snapchat for your learning, that's not one of our supported technologies. This is a completely different concept here. So I'm trying to emphasize just how important that language really is, but it's not just language. There's a much deeper thinking that comes through the leadership, not just my own leadership, but those around me, working with me. An example of Loop and the way we'll be able to use this is the way we've been able to introduce a learning portfolio. Most institutions would talk about an e-portfolio. Well, for me, an e-portfolio is inherently technocentric. It's about the technology itself. I've got one eye on the clock here, so I've just got 5 minutes to wrap up. In many respects, even calling it a learning portfolio, even though that's quite subtle, it's quite significant, it doesn't take it far enough for me, but that language has made a huge impact in the way this new system, this new platform has been introduced and the purpose it serves within DCU. So we don't talk about an e-portfolio, we talk about Loop Reflect, an environment to support self-reflection, self-regulation, and so forth. I'm not perhaps telling that story quite as well because I've just got a eye on the time. Let me go to the last example I'll share with you at DCU where leadership and language have become really crucial. About 6 months ago, we were going through the consultation for a new strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan. And typically institutions will go out in this period when you're having a plan, a strategy, to go and have town hall sessions to discuss with people what it is you think should be in the plan. Well, why wouldn't we do the same thing online? In fact, if we didn't do that kind of dialogue online, we wouldn't be walking the talk of being a modern digital era institution. So DCU Fuse was a highly successful experience to engage in an open way, to invite our stakeholders to tell us what type of institution we should be. DCU Fuse took place over 24 hours. It was a 25-hour, technically, online consultation envisioning exercise, an additional hour because we had the Minister of Education who was going to open the experience, which didn't happen in the end because his schedule got changed, but we had to add an hour on. This was a structured series of conversations over that 24 hours where we used a dedicated online environment to embrace people's ideas, to challenge our own thinking. In this case, the slide you're looking at is at midnight Irish time. I led the discussion with George Siemens, So we invited a number of guests from all around the world to come in to contribute to our envisioning about the future. DCU Fuse was also physically very visible because we had students and staff. In fact, students slept in the library overnight, and you can see the t-shirts and things. So this, I think, is a really good metaphor of distributed leadership and action and building ownership around change, and the type of change we want to be change makers rather than change takers. I won't go on to any more detail other than to say that there were thousands of discussion posts in this 24-hour period, and in many cases staff, this is their first experience of truly being an online learner. They teach online, but they don't necessarily be online learners themselves. This slide also is important and symbolic because that's the university president there. And without positional leadership, the importance of leadership from the top, none of this would have happened. But of course, equally, as I've argued, as I'm coming to wrap up here, none of this would have happened without the middle out and the ground up leadership as well, from all the people who contributed to making DCU Fuse such a successful event, which has now led to the launch of our new strategic plan. So I guess if there's one final comment I want to make, perhaps I'll give you two comments. The words and ideas we have can change the world, and the leadership brings those ideas. It brings the language, the vision. We can't do it by ourselves, nonetheless. So I guess the one final item I'd like you to kind of go away with, by all means continue on and ask me questions, recognizing I'm a little tight on time here, is I'm just wanting to come back to the point I made earlier, that the function of leadership is to produce more leaders, not more followers. So experiences such as DCU Fuse were highly successful in building a culture of leadership and distributing leadership around the institution. I think I'll stop on that note. We've come right up to the 1 hour. I see some people have had to disappear, which is fine. One or two problems by connectivity. Feel like I probably shortchanged you a little bit. I'll stay online for 5 minutes or so if people want to talk with me and continue conversation. But I've done far more talking than I've needed to probably for this session. So if you've got questions, comments, now's the opportunity. Otherwise, by all means, do follow up, email me personally if you want any of the references I've referred to.
Thank you so much for the webinar, Mark. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, everyone, for being here. If you have any questions, feel free. We're not in a hurry. So the webinar itself, the recordings will be online. They will be online tomorrow, and the presentation itself as well. I will send you all an email about it when it's online, so you can take a look at it. So are there any other questions? Oh, I see some.
Thanks, Gavin. A little bit too much talk of me, but I particularly wanted to focus on leadership rather than the problems that we face, or necessarily the solutions, and emphasize just how important leadership is. With a little bit of advertising, some of you may be interested in the Leadership Academy that we offer as part of Empower, the Empower program. You can find more information about this Leadership Academy on the website, on the Empower website. We offer this in Brussels at this time once each year, but we also have the ability, and we recently did a session for an institution in Greece, so we're able to customize this for countries or for particular institutions. Happy to talk offline more about that, and Lizzie can share with you a brochure or more information. But I'm very passionate about building the next generation of leaders, because some of us are getting a little older and there is so much that's needed in our institutions and for the future of our nations, and higher education is the engine of the changes.